Frenulum Cave. At 2,000 feet deep, Frenulum Cave is not too deep compared to the deepest caves on Earth. However, unlike these deeper caves, Frenulum Cave carries a deadly and horrifying trap. The trap inside Frenulum Cave is its length. Frenulum Cave is one of the longest caves in the world. It spreads and winds into many sprawling tunnels. These tunnels make navigation in Frenulum Cave extremely difficult and often impossible for even the most experienced cavers. Of all the expeditions into Frenulum Cave, none have been successful at fully mapping out the cave. However, not all have been fatal. The few cavers that have successfully returned from the deepest point of the cave have described the exit trip as being extremely disorienting, as if the cave had changed around them. They have stated that it felt that they had only made it out by sheer luck. This brings us to our individual who is feeling unusually lucky. Jonathan Galvin, born January of 1982, was a thrill seeker since he was a child. When he was young, he often spent his free time after school or on weekends building bike ramps in his yard, or exploring the woods behind his house. As a teenager, Jonathan would often go on hikes or go rock climbing with his friends. Jonathan would often tell outlandish but eerie stories about what could go wrong on a journey and how he would defeat these challenges. On hikes, he would tell stories about how he would fight off a cougar to save his friends. And on one instance, during a trip to Mexico, John told a story so outlandish it earned him the nickname of Trippin' Johnny. He told the story of how he would fight off a horde of monkeys using 2 coconuts to save his family. Johnny went into extreme detail about the appearance of each individual monkey, including details regarding the monkeys' genitals. Jonathan's stories have been compared to an acid trip, thus earning him his nickname. However, Jonathan never managed to utilize his creative or adventurous spirit in school or life, and he ended up failing to graduate high school. Jonathan then spent a year living with his parents until their shocking death in a plane accident while headed for California. John was only 19 at the time, and he was forced to grow up in an instant, losing his creative and adventurous side and being basically forced to work a low-paying job in the government. He moved to Oklahoma and worked his life away for 24 years. Over this time, Jonathan had become more and more eager to return to the life he had as a kid. John just wanted to escape his life and go adventuring with his friends. However, at this point in his life, John had no connections to his friends. He had gone through many off and on relationships with women and men. He had also suffered through some severe mental health issues involving extreme paranoia, resulting in an introverted and reserved lifestyle. To escape his monotonous life, John found a cave guide on Craigslist that would take him out caving. The caver that would end up joining John on his disastrous trip was amateur caver Chris Gerspacher. Now here begins John's story. John was a beginner caver, but he believed that his skills in rock climbing and hiking would compensate. He lied to Chris about his skills and ended up going to Frenulum Cave with Chris. Chris had also been dishonest with John when deciding to take him to Frenulum Cave. The cave had been shut down and deemed illegal to explore due to the danger involved with it. The government shut down the cave based on danger around seismic activity. If something were to go wrong, Chris and John would not have help coming for them. Their trip inside Frenulum Cave began on the anniversary of John's parents' death on the second week of September. They began their descent into the cave with the first wide passageway. The cave tunnels followed a steady but shallow descent into the ground. Chris was determined to reach the deepest part of the cave, and he had brought a large hiking backpack full of purple Kool-Aid and bananas to survive off of during the journey that could last days. Slowly, the light that beamed in from the entrance of the cave faded from view, and John and Chris took a break to take in the dark abyss that would be their home for the time being. Then they both activated their headlamps and headed deeper into the now illuminated abyss. Chris was unfamiliar with the cave, as it was his first venture into it, and the pair had ended up taking many wrong turns and reaching many dead ends. After each dead end that the pair had reached, they ended up finding another tunnel that would allow them to continue deeper into the cave. After a while, the cave had become musty and the air was thick and had an aroma similar to that of dried saliva. This air slowed down the two as they had quickly become exhausted due to the poor air quality. Chris pulled out a sleeping bag, and the two spent the night in this single person-sized sleeping bag. When John awoke, Chris was gone, along with his backpack full of bananas and purple Kool-Aid. John had become reasonably scared, and he began to panic. He calmed down and assumed that Chris must have continued downward into the cave. John then ventured further into the cave. It wasn't long until John found signs of Chris's whereabouts. First, John found a path of banana peels, but then John began to hear the screams. The screams were a mixture of moans and grunts, along with the horrifying rasp that they had. It seemed as if they had been going on for hours. It sounded like his vocal cords were shredded to a pulp from a day worth of screaming. John sped off toward the inhuman noises and stopped when he began to see fluid on the walls. The walls were coated in a white, almost mucus-like substance that was sticky to the touch and salty to the tongue. John had heard of large slugs that lived in moist caves like this one. He feared that Chris was being somehow raped by these slugs, so he built the courage to fight off these slugs and save Chris. But the screams had stopped. John began to listen intently, hoping to hear what caused Chris to stop screaming. But then John heard Chris whimper and cry as he got dressed. Then Chris began running towards John, and John stood there and waited for Chris to come to him. When John saw Chris, he saw that his clothes were ripped to shreds. His backpack was missing, and he appeared beat up. He had black rings around his eyes, and there was blood all over the front of his pants. Chris began to tell John about what caused all of this. Before he could start talking, a long appendage came from behind and fish-hooked his mouth and pulled him back into the darkness. John could never mistake something like that. The appendage that grabbed Chris, it was a penis. John immediately began to sprint away, but the cave just wasn't like he remembered, and he was lost. He kept having to crawl through extremely tight holes that forced him to perform breath holds to get through, until eventually he reached a dead end and was stuck behind a hole that he couldn't get back out of. Now, what I did not tell you earlier is that John worked as a Oklahoma State penis inspector. John had inspected, taste tested, and cock rated many penises within his lifetime. But he had never seen one as horrifyingly long as the one that had took Chris into the darkness. Now John, he had heard of long-dicked creatures tormenting fellow penis inspectors before, but John never thought that these stories were true. He heard that a penis creature would fuck penis inspectors' wives. These stories had always come from disgruntled employees who had lost their jobs, so John had never put any credibility on these stories. But now, John was sitting in this hole, and he'd stayed there for many hours, and he awaited the horrors that would be coming for him. Since John had no wife and Chris was gone, there was nothing left for the creature to fuck. Eventually, John fell asleep. John awoke and felt the pain of 1,000 bees and wasps and hornets in his asshole. He looked up to see a monkey-like creature above him. It had a long, veiny, hairless tail that was wrapped around his waist and was penetrating his anus. He then looked down to see that his penis had been ripped from his body. Before John could scream, a long and bony finger squeezed his lips shut. "Your penis is not mine to expect, my good friend." The creature spoke to John, and that was the last thing he heard before passing out again. When John awoke, he got dressed and began to run out of the cave. The cave now looked as though it was one long tunnel, and John could already see the light coming from outside. Every step John took sent pain through his perforated asshole and mangled scrotum. But it wasn't long before John had exited the cave. John did not bother to call 911 to save Chris, because he did not want any association with the horrendous creature known as the Penis Monkey. John returned to his humble life as a penis inspector, although every penis he saw reminded him of the horrendous, multiple foot long shaft that he felt probe his insides. Sometimes it would scare him so much that he would orgasm. However, his penis had previously been fucking ripped from his body, so it ended up every time was that a bit of blood would spurt from his pussy. The only thing that could soothe his mental pain would be listening to his favorite band, Weezer. However, John would be forced to face his encounter with the penis monkey when the police came to interrogate him about the disappearance of Chris. John relayed this whole story to the investigator, except with even more detail about the sensation of being surprised butt-fucked by a monkey's moby huge cock. Needless to say, the cops did not believe him. They then revealed that they had found Chris's mutilated body at the mouth of Frenulum Cave with a message written on the "Do Not Enter" sign beside the body. The message read, "Jonathan, nice guy Galvin, was here. Yeah, his middle name was Nice Guy." Also, the message on the sign was written in cum. Anyway, John was then arrested for rape, second-degree murder, and desecration of a corpse. Also, 43 counts of child pornography. Yeah, he claimed that was accidentally saved from one of his school-wide mandatory penis inspections, but the police did not believe him because actually, penis inspecting is actually a secret job in the government, so the cops wouldn't know about it. John would be spending the rest of his life in jail. During the first year of his incarceration, John died in his jail cell. The police claimed the cause of death was a suicide by hanging, but he was found alone in his cell with damage to the inside of his throat and the outside, along with a prolapsed anus. There was also foreign DNA found in his body. The police linked it to his black cellmate, who was promptly given the life sentence. He was executed by firing squad a week before John had even died. Anyway, that was the story of John Galvin, as recounted by him during his interrogation and gathered from state files regarding his arrest and death. Do I believe his story? I don't fucking know. I will tell you that being raped by a monkey does sound pretty hot though.